Okay, so I'll get rolling here. I think we got the tech figured out. Pleasure to be here, and I thank you very much for the invitation. We actually got invited to speak about the human potential for peace, which coincidentally is a topic or title of a book that I wrote some years ago. And in part one, rather quickly, I thought I'd just share some thoughts about the human potential for peace, because so many people in this day and age believe that we don't really have a strong potential for peace as humans. So that's an important point, and addresses our invitation actually to come and talk on this topic. But part two also picks up the same theme of we having capacity and potential for peacemaking by looking at peace systems. And peace systems are relatively newly elaborated concept, which Genevieve and I, as well as our co-workers, have been working on. And the second part of the talk then explores what is the potential of looking at peace systems more generally. What relevance would they have to making a peace in the Middle East and elsewhere? So first, part one, with looking at the human potential for peace, there's the book I mentioned with the same title. I looked across the ethnographic and historical records and found that there's not a lot of countries that don't engage in warfare, but there's certainly a substantial number of them ethnographically, over 74 specifically listed in these books. And I'm sure that there are many other examples as well. And additionally, not all nations have militaries on the planet today. So war is something that's not everywhere present. It's not everywhere pleasant either. That's my Freudian slip. Another way of looking at the human potential for peace is actually to take a look as to what the simplest, most basic type of human society, the type of society that's been with us over the millennia for some 97%, 99% of our human existence. And these are nomadic forager bands. These societies are a good way to look at our human nature, so to speak. And if you look across nomadic forager bands, across different contexts, different continents, you find certain things. They tend to be small. Membership is flexible and is changing, which is important. But related to our topics of human nature and war and peace, they tend to be egalitarian and non-hierarchical, which is something so different from most societies today. They're engaged in a lot of cooperation within and across the bands. Across the bands is important. I won't dwell on all these anthropological details, but the seventh point, they have few material positions and they're non-warring as a group. I'm going to come back to the non-warring part of it in just a few slides. So related to the egalitarianism, there aren't leaders. That's another way of getting at that. And that's important because nobody really has the authority to lead a war, charge people into a battle and so forth. And others tend not to follow that because that's not really in their interests. So looking towards a more positive view of humanity in terms of pro-sociality, I really like this saying from the Yagan people, who are an extinct culture at this point, unfortunately, but lived on the tip of Tierra del Fuego in South America. The whole goal of life and the whole goal of raising children is to create good and useful human beings. And that sets us up for looking more generally at nomadic foragers in terms of what's going on in their societies. If you look at daily life, there's all sorts of cooperation, sharing, helping, good deeds prevailing on a daily basis. There's a great deal of cooperation, whether it's amongst women who tend to do gathering or amongst men who tend to do most of the hunting, and it's not an all or none, but that's the pattern. And I find this just intriguing. Meat sharing is ubiquitous in these foragers. I've yet to find an ethnographic case from anywhere in the world where they don't share meat from a hunt. So this really links people together. Think about it. Not every hunter is going to have good luck every day. And sometimes the hunter is going to be sick or injured and relies on other people. And so humans in this type of social organization are very dependent on each other. They cooperate and they share and engage in a lot of reciprocity that's positive. And not to only talk about the positive, there is also, in many of the societies, not all of them, patterns of revenge. If somebody does something wrong to you, like if you lose a brother, somebody kills your brother, you might go with your other brother and try to kill that victim, the perpetrator, I should say. So there's this negative type of reciprocity that occurs also, but that often gets 99% of the attention, when in fact it really is happening about 1% of the time in social life, if you see what I'm saying. There are also a whole variety of rules for correct conduct. So we could call them norms, and we're going to come back to norms when we talk about peace systems that help preserve the peace and keep the peace. So these are all elements of the society which Genevieve and I would argue should be taken as a whole view and not just isolately, in an isolated way, pull out elements or examples of aggression. So let me just read this slide. There's a little bit of different types of information here. Nomadic hunter-gatherers live in bands whose composition varies as people transfer regularly among groups. And that's an important point because it's hard to get a war going between these little groups because there's friends and neighbors and relatives in other little bands, and that's likely to be different 6 months later. Nomadic foragers have few material possessions, so there's not much to fight over, and they also tend to be very spread out and dispersed. Lacking authoritative leadership, nomadic band societies nonetheless manage to deal with much conflict through avoidance, discussion, group meetings, contests, ostracism, and in other aggression-limiting ways. There that is in golden print. Avoidance, discussion, group meetings, contest, ostracism, and various other. They resolve their conflicts, most of them without any violence whatsoever. Here's an example from India, Palayan people. Avoidance is definitely an option for them. They just prefer to avoid a conflict. If a problem persists, they may convene a conflict resolution assembly where the elders and others take place to help the people who are having a dispute work that out. They have an explicit nonviolent ethos. You should not engage in aggression. They don't feud, they don't war, and their homicide rate is very rare. So that's one example. Here's another one, this time from South Africa, from some classic films done by anthropologist John Marshall back in the 60s. This one's called The Meat Fight, and ironically, there's no fight actually in the film called a meat fight. Instead, as you can see from these screenshots, as a lot of discussion and working it out in accordance with the social norms. We can work this out peacefully, says one slide. You let the people decide what to do about the arrow. That's referring to rules, who owns the hunt based on the arrow. The dispute was resolved through discussion and reference to
Douglas,
yes.
Sorry for the interruption, but the slides are not changing in our Zoom in the broadcasting meeting.
What's that?
Yes, could you please check with the IT person there?
Yes, thank you. He's checking it right now. What
Awesome.
slide are you seeing out of curiosity?
We are on the first one. Yeah.
The very first one. Okay.
Yes.
What would a presentation be without a few technological challenges?
Of course, yeah. Thank you, and sorry for the interruption. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you interrupted before we went through the entire thing. Sooner is better than later in this case.
Yeah, Mehran just typed it on the chat, but I saw you didn't read it, so yeah, that's why I felt like I should interrupt now.
Yes, no worries. We'll give the tech person a minute or two here, see what, I guess the alternative, but we'll hope it gets working. The alternative is I can try to be a little more verbally descriptive as well as what you would be seeing. I always used to laugh when I'd go to the old slide lectures, back a few decades when they were literally slides. And someone put up an entire screen full of small illegible numbers and then proclaim, as you can clearly see. You think we're good? I'm trying to move it forward. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you see, what slide are you seeing now?
The first one, yeah.
How about now? Overview, perhaps?
Yes, overview. We got it. Yeah.
Okay. So this is what you missed real quick.
Awesome.
A couple books and comments on war is not present everywhere. Some shots of ethnographic foragers, just highlighting some of the features of the society being egalitarian, reciprocal sharing, cooperation. At least you heard my verbals, so I think you may have hopefully gotten some of the idea. Oops. Look back here. Okay, I'll just continue. If you're seeing slides, please stop me if you're not seeing the correct slide.
Okay, we will let you know.
Okay, So this was the slide I read literally about handling conflict and in these societies, there's different ways like avoidance. Somehow we're not synchronized below and above. You see what I mean?
We are seeing the one handling conflict. Yeah.
Great. That's good. And now the issue is on this room, we're seeing a different slide. So
Okay.
fearless tech person is working on it. Now we got two tech people working on it. So please bear with me. Thank you. Okay. Are we moving forward, fellow folks?
So that you can move to the right. Okay, so now start sharing.
Are you seeing a film that says the meat fight with two pictures at this point?
Start sharing now. Start sharing. Pause it.
Takes a village. Slideshow.
Get to the right slide and then start sharing.
Well, gosh, didn't happen anywhere. I'm teaching a class. I've learned that very easy. I've learned the trick always is call for help from the students. And they always know. Yeah.
And so they don't. And it gets worse.
Now try it. Now try it.
I will try it.
Go back once more.
Both changed. Okay.
But you pause. Take share it, put it in presentation of on your hand, and then.
It's not working yet, right?
Yeah, we have the two tech folks here working on it at this point.
Okay.
So thank you for your patience. I'm sorry about the delays here, but they're working on it.
Yeah, it's okay. Macran suggests maybe we can continue without the slides, but whatever you prefer. Yeah.
Well, at least I need to see the slides because they're my script, so to speak.
Of
So,
course.
but we may have to do that. Let's just see how they. We've got three tech folks working on it. Says your screen share is loading. You are screen sharing.
Yes, now we can see the first slide.
Okay, that's good. That's progress. Go ahead. Seems to be changing the lower one, but not the top one. Ah, here we go. There was a delay. Somebody hit a button. Are you seeing some slides going by now?
Yes, we are on the fifth one, the nomadic. Now we are in the egalitarian. Yeah, it's
Okay.
changing. Yeah.
We're all going to do a collective cross our fingers here, right?
Okay. Fingers crossed.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Firefox is officially to blame. Always helps to set the blame, doesn't it? Thank you, folks. Okay.
Yeah, thanks to you. Yeah.
I will pick up the pace just a little bit if that's possible. And I am aware of the time here. I've been going 20 minutes, so I'll try to wrap this up in 10 or 15, and that's leaving more on time, certainly. Okay, so what about warfare? I mentioned before a little bit on nomadic foragers. Patrick Sotoberry and I did a study which published in Science really a decade ago now, but it has some key features basically showing the nomadic foragers, war among them is a real paucity. It's real unusual. And what we did was we looked at a sample we didn't select, but it's already out there in the anthropological literature, 21 nomadic forager societies. And we looked at all incidences of anybody being killed. And it turned out there were 148 of those cases. And with 21 societies, the range was quite different. 3 societies had absolutely 0 killings, lethal aggression. And the one very high society had 69, almost half of the entire number of 148 incidences. That group's the Tiwi from Australia, as a real way out outlier, as one reviewer put it. So for these events, if you look at the nature of them first in terms of killers and victims, 55% involved just one killer and one victim. That you would think sounds a lot more like homicide than war. One of them, another 23% involved just more than one killer, but one victim. And then you get the converse of that one. More than one killer to more than one victim is another 22%. And hardly ever, in fact, did you get just one killer killing more than one victim. In one case, I remember that was an adult killing 2 kids, unfortunately. So 78% of the lethal events involved only one victim. So you can start seeing where we're going with this in terms of not seeing a lot of incidences, which most people would consider to be warfare as a group-on-group phenomenon. Here's another way that we broke down the data for this article. 21 societies and 10 of them absolutely had no incidences of more than one perpetrator engaged in the act. So that means these 11 shown here either had more than one perpetrator killing one victim or more than one perpetrator killing 2 victims. Of course, the latter, I think, fits something that most people would consider could be war. It might be something else, but it could be war. So our overall consideration here, and I'm going to click back one slide. See the lines there that just go way out? That's the Tiwi, the one society with the 69 cases. And so what we did here was we just pulled apart Tiwi as their own case, and then all 20 other societies in the middle column and the grand total on the right. And the ones in red are really the interesting ones. The Tiwi had relatively less interpersonal aggression, but a whole lot of intergroup aggression, 55% intergroup aggression. And if you look at the all others, it flips, right? Most of the aggression in the other 20 societies, 63% was involving interpersonal reasons, interpersonal types of aggression, whereas only 15% involved something that looked like it could be intergroup. So patterns and exceptions. Our conclusion basically is one person killing one person is not war. Killing within a local group is not war. Interpersonal motivations such as jealousy do not reflect war. And then such things as group executions within a group, starvation, cannibalism, hunting accidents, and so forth. That's not war. So in sum, most lethal aggression among nomadic foragers constitutes homicide, hunting accidents, and things like this. There are some cases of feuding back and forth, and interestingly, that was the pattern for the Tiwi, and only a minority involved actual group-on-group back and forth warfare. So nomadic foragers are not particularly warlike, is the main conclusion there. Now we're going on to part 2, where we're going to look at peace systems. And the first idea, we should define peace systems. We like to call them clusters of neighboring societies that don't make war with each other. They sometimes make war outside the peace system, but sometimes they don't. So you have 2 different types of peace systems. They do not make war on each other and sometimes not with outsiders either. Neighbors have created peace in various times and places, transitioning war systems into peace systems in some of our cases. So that's really important if you're going to think about how can we create peace. We'll also, as we go forward here, we'll do two things. We'll consider 3 examples briefly, so you can get sort of a feel and a touch for what we are talking about when we're talking about a peace system, and then give you some findings from the comparative study just at the end. The key idea here for us is, can the study of peace systems provide insights for peace building in other contexts, such as in the Middle East? And I'm sure we're surrounded by Middle Eastern experts here. We're not Middle East experts, but we're really curious if you have thoughts on how what we found in a more general sense, ethnographically, historically, politically, might be applicable. And we hope you do get some insights here. So this is from an article with Genevieve and I, along with colleagues from Columbia University, as well as some of our former students, put together quite a research-intensive, data-intensive collecting endeavor. It was published in Humanities and Social Sciences Communications, one of the Nature journals, in 2021. The mere existence of peace systems is important because it demonstrates that creating peaceful intergroup relations is possible, whether the social units are tribal societies, nations, or actors within a regional system. And at the start of this endeavor, we descriptively looked at some of the peace systems and isolated out 8 hypotheses that we wanted to look at specifically. You got to draw the line somewhere, and these seem most promising. I'll not go through each one in much detail. Again, there's an article that interested folks could read on this, but things like overarching identity, where identity is not just parochial, but it can be overarching across groups. Many interconnections and in fact interdependencies between groups. And importantly, as we'll see, norms and values that support peace, peaceful norms and values, which are reinforced anthropologically or culturally by symbols, rituals, ceremonies that reinforce the norms and values, superordinate institutions, that one may speak for itself, mechanisms to resolve conflict that are not violent or warlike, and finally, visionary peace leadership has a role to play here. These are all our hypotheses. So let's consider 3 examples. The first one would be an ethnographic case from Brazil. I'm just showing in this slide that some of our other cases anthropologically. We're going to look at the Brazil in the yellow at the bottom. Brazil's Upper Xingu River Basin tribes, the European Union, and the Nordic nations. Just 3 quick examples. Again, I apologize for rushing this, but of course, the tech problems threw us a little over time and into a more rushed mode. So one of the cool things about this example is a lot of anthropologists have been there and studied the different tribes. And in fact, an anthropologist named Thomas Greger interviewed folks from all of these tribes, looking at peace in particular. So this is nice in the anthropological literature to have a good database of different folks reporting. Back in the 1800s, a German explorer, Karl Wandenstein, passed through this area of the Upper Xingu, shown on the map. If you look for purple, that's the Xingu, and the upper is south in this sense, or low on the map. And he observed that they did not war with each other. It was a peaceful social system. Then fast forward to 1938 or so, and anthropologist Buell Quain lived among one of the groups, the Tremai, and also reported a lack of warfare with Tremai and their neighbors. So this is, again, a cool anthropological example, because we can fast forward to the 80s and 90s when Tom Greger was working in this area, as were others. And he writes as a conclusion, during the 100 years over which we have records, there is no evidence of warfare among the Xingu groups. That was 1990, as you can see on the screen. So fast forward another 33 years, and we still don't have warfare in this area. So they've got a pretty nicely established peace system going on. Ceremonies and symbols are important for them. In the words of one Xinguano quoted by Greger, "We don't make war. We have festivals for the chiefs, to which all the villages come. We sing, dance, trade, and wrestle." I'll come back to wrestling in a moment. So what these groups do, an overarching identity, remember that was one of our hypotheses, they expand the us beyond just the individual tribe. They belong not solely to their tribe, but to a larger interdependent social system linked by things like trade, intermarriage, and joint ceremonies. They also hold and very much nurture anti-war, anti-aggressive values. Peace is moral, literally, for the Upper Xingu, and war is immoral. Violence is a pathetic mark of failed leadership. So these are all the types of things when we talk about non-warring norms and values is what we're referring to ethnographically. And I said we come back to wrestling. Wrestling is a big deal for these societies within the villages and amongst them. And here's a joint ceremony. When our bellies are hot with anger, we wrestle and the anger is gone. So they have other ways of expressing their discontents. So to sum up for the Upper Xingu, this peace system is reinforced in an ongoing fashion through inter-village trade, intermarriage, and joint ceremonies. And these social institutions reflect the interconnections and promote interdependence among the different tribal groups. We can also explain anti-war and anti-violent norms and values play a role in keeping the peace. And I already mentioned war is immoral and so forth. Moving up to the middle part, again, they expand the us to include the them rather than drawing rigid us thems. They expand the us to include the them in an overarching identity. So there's different qualitative elements that support some of these hypotheses we're talking about. And the same is true in the second example. And one reason that I like to talk about the European Union to my students and in other cases like this when talking about peace systems is often I would get the question, well, that's great for Upper Xingu, but what about the real world of the nations and politics? Well, they're more than just an ethnographic curiosity. You can find examples of peace systems among modern nations, and in this case, the region of Europe. So this started as you may or may not recall, way back in the Treaty of Rome, where the idea was to create an ever closer union as sort of setting the goal. And key in terms of goal setting was Jean Monnet and his colleagues, Robert Schuman, former foreign minister from France, Konrad Adenauer from Germany, and so forth. All of these men and people of the generations in Europe had lived through this absolutely devastating crisis of World War II. And I think that was a large motivator, in fact, as to how they get so many people along board. But at the same time, this required their leadership. Remember the peace leadership element to looking at peace systems, to conceptualize a continent, in this case of Europe, that could be free from war. Peace building was the major goal, after all, of European integration. So got quite a few slides here. Again, we have written on this, Genevieve and I. I'll show you the reference to the 2021 article shortly. I just want to keep one eye to the time, so we're not too rushed. Here, lesson, middle of this slide. What was to become the EU began with a series of baby steps, moving in stages towards the overall goal of European integration. And that occurred to me that might be something that we need in the Middle Eastern context as well, rather than focusing on peace immediately is what steps, concrete steps. And that's a lesson from how the European Union was created. The overall approach in this case was through economic integration. And that's an interesting case. We don't see that in all peace systems. In fact, this is sort of an unusual case where an explicit plan to put key elements of the economic system in degrees, again, baby steps, as more integrated and more independent was actually part of the peace plan. So that's an interesting case. This is just pointing out in terms of conflict resolution, for instance, that there exists a court of justice of the European communities now, which was set up as a new level of courts. I like to say up the level sometimes. You have courts, in the local municipal courts, you up the level to the state courts, you of course have federal courts if we're talking the United States, Supreme Court, et cetera. And here they're adding a regional court that has 27 justices, which rotate through the system. So identity is another one of our hypotheses. There are certain elements of ritual and ceremony. There's the flag, of course, has been created symbolically, as in the first flag of the United States. It's stars in a circle, reflecting equality and unity at the same time. That's symbolism. That's flown along with national flags. If you've been to Europe or seen pictures along virtually everywhere you go. There's European flags, adding that level of common identity symbolically through the flag. The euro is not in every European Union country, but it's getting there. I put at the bottom, couldn't resist this one. For me, anything like this is, 2 steps forward and 1 step back in the case of Brexit. So don't be, don't unfortunately look at Brexit, say, oh, the whole thing's falling apart, as some people have done. Just go, okay, well, there go the Brits. Let's see if they want to rejoin in a few years. Norms and values, again, this just shows how much things have changed. This is a quote from a Europarliamentarian from the Netherlands, all the way back in 1994. And his observation back then was, peace is therefore the primary achievement of the process of European integration. This is the same continent that was torn apart in the 1940s and World War II. Shift in norms and values has been important. Again, I won't belabor that point. Expanding the us to include the them. I lived in Finland and taught international students from other parts of the world, including the EU. And what I found interesting then is to talk to them, they often just referred to being European, and being from Europe and so forth. Just like in the States, again, it depends on context. In some case, you might say, and I'll see my colleague here to the right, he referred to us as Tar Heels being from North Carolina. That's a local identity, right? But we also, if we're traveling abroad, we'll just say we're Americans, probably, rather than North Carolinians and so forth. We have multiple levels of identity. We expand our us to include the them. So third example, real quickly, is the Nordic country. This is a cool one. It's the 5 Nordic countries, including the Faroe Islands, Greenland, and the Åland Islands. They have not warred with each other in a peace system in over 200 years. And they come from a history of previous wars. So things have changed gradually. Again, Monet, I think, would say step by step to the fact where war is just not considered anything that you would do nowadays. Here it is reflected in a quote on the left. For decades now, when tensions rise, Nordic leaders reach for the telephone instead of for the gun. Really, again, the thought of going to war in Nordic land is just unthinkable. Here's another quote. No one can imagine war between countries anymore. They are seen as constituting a kind of family. Nordic ministers meeting in what's called the Nordic Council, which reflects another one of the elements of a peace system, which is overarching governance. So we're wrapping this up, believe it or not. I said I'd share some findings comparison-wise. So what my colleagues and I have been doing is basically comparing 16 peace systems from historical, political, ethnographic contexts with a randomly selected comparison group of other societies and checking out these hypotheses that I mentioned before. Here they are again, just as a quick reminder, looking at things like from the bottom up, visionary peace leadership, conflict management, superordinate institutions, and so forth. And what we're conceptualizing as the big question is, how can we take a system that's based on sort of a negative reciprocity of I do bad to you and you do bad to me and we don't trust each other and things are hostile, over to a peace system where things are much more positive, with a positive reciprocity of helping each other out, getting along well, and in fact, war has become unthinkable. So if we look specifically at this table, taking 12 o'clock on the left, you have war values and norms. And if you go over to the right, where we'd like to be, a peace system, you have peace values and norms. And I choose that one at 12 o'clock. And in fact, we put it at 12 o'clock because that turned out to be a very important, the most important of the 8 variables, in fact, in our study. But just to pick another one here for illustration purposes, let's go down to the bottom. We've talked a bit about identity. In a war system, you tend to get the us versus them mentality or parochial identities being very strong. Towards a peace system, you have the multiple identities we talked about, and there is overarching identity for a peace system. I won't go through all 8, but that's just a symbolic representation. This chart, I will just take a few moments to discuss. And by doing so, again, you have the 8 main features on the left side. You've got peace systems, N16, with the mean value, and then non-peace systems to the right of that, N of 30, larger N, with their mean value. What do the mean values reflect? Please look at the bottom of the chart. For these variables, the codes are 1 means none, 2 is weak, 3 is moderate, and 4 is strong. So in other words, closer to 4, the stronger, the more you got this. So now let's jump up, bear with me, I don't have a pointer, but jump up to overarching identity near the top there. It's a peace-related hypothesis. Under peace systems, that's a 3.0, but under non-peace systems, it's only a 2.25. And if you go to the far right, you'll see the significance. That's a highly significant difference. Interconnections is also highly significant. These are the interconnections of different types, such as intermarriage, for example, a 3 point compared to a 2.5. Now, out of the 8, we found significant results for 6 out of the 8. And I think now that I've sort of given you some hints how to look at this chart. Overall, even the ones that are non-significant show non-significant trends in this direction. So overall, point by point, the peace systems have a higher value as you read down that column than do the non-peace sample, if you see what I'm saying. So there's a general support for this. Now, we also did the flip. If you go down to the bottom of the chart, there's war-related. We looked at 4 war-related, and here you'd expect the opposite. And in fact, that's what we found, with 3 out of the 4 being significant. Ethnocentrism didn't play out. I guess everybody has some degree of ethnocentrism is one conclusion there. But now you see the numbers are larger for the non-peace system column. For example, take warring values and norms, third up from the bottom, warring values and norms. It's almost a 3 for the comparison cultures, but under a 2, just under a 2 for peace systems. So different lessons here, different conclusions from this. The war and the peace is not all or none. It's more gradated, right? It's a continuum. And interestingly, you can have war values at the same time you can have peace values, but it's a question of which is really predominating. And when you remember that peace systems are clusters of neighboring societies that don't make war with each other, very often, but not always, the peace norms and values are reflected for within that peace system. However, they reserve the right that they might be war or hostile outside the system. So there's all sorts of subtleties that are important here, and we're trying to explore and take a look at this. This one's showing a neat machine learning analysis that's called random forest. And it just ranks as to what's the most important in determining a difference between a peace system and a non-peace system. And lo and behold, non-warring norms tops the list. And it's relatively speaking twice as important as non-warring rituals and about twice as important as non-warring values. But those are the 3 top in the ranking: norms, rituals, values. Rituals we see as a reflection of values, an expression of norms. So that's a neat, interesting cluster. But apropos to the next paper we're going to hear, moving a little bit further down, economic interdependence is also somewhat strong, as are a variety of other factors here. So we're trying to get to the bottom of the question here. I promised you some references earlier on. The article I keep referring to by Fry and Suyak, Leibovitz, Coleman et al. In Societies Within Peace Systems, Avoid War and Build Positive Intergroup Relationships. And I'd be really interested either in the discussion if we have time for it today, or subsequently, please reach out to us, or maybe at another conference or whatever. Hear what applications you think this might have, if any, for the Middle East. Open access, a very short, more of a op-ed than an article. Peaceful societies are not utopian fantasies. They exist. That's in the Bolton, the Atomic Scientists. These are easy to Google, and I think you'll have this on your screen. You can check it out again. A YouTube, we actually made a short film, 8.5 minutes or so, which is interesting, very general for the general public type of overview of what a peace system is. So please watch it if you can. Just Google A Path Away from War on YouTube. And then there's a science article earlier on that I wrote on my own. Closing thoughts. Kenneth Boulding once quipped, anything that exists is possible. And we argue that peace systems exist and therefore they're possible. So the next question, of course, becomes what insights can we gain from studying how peace systems manage to keep the peace? There may actually be a relatively small number of variables that can be shifted to transform a system from a warring system into a peace system. It may not really be as complicated. It may not really be that proverbial rocket science, right? We might just find the key things: economics and norms and values, and doing some rituals and overarching identity. And wow, bingo, we can move substantially towards a peace system. Norms and values that do not accept the practice of war are of great importance. That's what our findings show here. Also high on the importance list are security interdependence and economic interdependence. And we're out of time, if not over time. Thank you very much for bearing with me on this one. And let's turn it over to Maureen. We'd love to hear your talk now.
Thank you very much. I think you have to close this screen so I could share mine.
Maureen.
Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, at least online we can see it. Yeah.
Good. I'm really sorry if there's any noise in the background. They're doing construction. They just started 2 minutes ago. Okay, so I will start now.
Yes, we've got it. We've got it.
So my presentation is sustaining peace through regional economic integration in the Persian Gulf. So it's a bit practical in comparison to the previous presentation, but I'm glad that we heard the previous presentation first. It really dovetails greatly with what I'm trying to achieve with my paper. So basically, this is the paper is part of the larger project I'm working on. It's called the Integrated Futures Initiative. It focuses on 6 GCC states, as well as Iraq and Iran. And basically what I mean by sustaining peace is a UN term that's being used, which broadly defines activities aimed at preventing the outbreak, the escalation, and the continuation recurrence of conflict. So rather than a pure focus on security issues, the aim here is to find viable pathways for a regional economic cooperation framework and eventually integration. I've been involved in a lot of track 2 and track 1.5 dialogues on Iran, the GCC relations, and thankfully we heard good news on Friday with regards to the Iran-Saudi agreement. And much of the dialogue that I've been involved in has been really focused on the security angle. And that's why we really tried to develop something that would be practical in essence, but also to have that conflict resolution angle in a way that could have a practical output. So that's why this paper particularly, I'm looking at what are these new horizons for regional diplomacy that we're seeing in the past few years, which culminated in a recent agreement, as well as practical multilateral areas for cooperation on energy, environment, and food security. So I will go quickly on what we actually faced in 2017 to 2021. So Trump years, we had uneasy waves in the Persian Gulf. So as soon as the Trump administration came to power, its Middle East policies were cleared. We saw that the GCC states, 3 of them, UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain, along with Egypt, imposed a blockade on Qatar. So that basically created a rift within the GCC, 6 of the 8 countries under consideration in this paper, and which lasted until 2021. At the same time, we saw the Trump administration impose the maximum pressure campaign on Iran, which was an anti-Iran policy that culminated the entire Middle East policies of that administration. Specifically in 2019 and 2020, we saw military attacks where we saw drone and cruise missile attacks at the Aramco oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, as well as ships at the Fujairah port in the UAE. We saw that the US facilities were attacked by Iran inside Iraq. We saw an unmanned aircraft by the US was downed by Iran, and an Iranian general was assassinated inside Iraq by the US. Which also ended with the Iran shooting down a passenger aircraft in Iran. So these military tensions were really not seen in the past in the region, particularly in the context of a regional-wide conflict. The last issue was basically in 2003 when it was the fall of Saddam Hussein and the US war on terror. So all of this is to say that the region faced a tense period, and it really led to a reframing of the foreign policy and regional policies of each of the states. So that's why by Joe Biden's victory in November 2020 elections, we saw that the region was moving forward towards engagement more than conflict. So before the inauguration of Joe Biden in January 2021, we had the Al Ola summit, which ended the blockade on Qatar and basically ended the rift within the GCC. At the same time, but specifically since 2019 and 2020, we have these UAE-Iran talks, Saudi-Iran talks, as well as Kuwait-Iran talks that have been concurrently moving forward, which for the UAE and Kuwait, it ended with re-establishing diplomatic ties and reappointing the ambassadors of those two countries inside Iran. And recently, we saw the culmination of the ongoing security dialogues between Iran and Saudi Arabia inside Iraq and Oman led to this agreement in Beijing. This is to say that regional countries themselves have been really trying to culminate an environment for dialogue and cooperation inside the region, and that's a key fact to consider. At the same time, we also had these high-level visits between the leaders of Oman and Iran and Qatar to each of those countries, and the 2022 World Cup that took place in Qatar also brought about a new sense of regional cooperation inside the GCC and basically ended officially the Saudi and UAE skirmishes with Qatar. During this time, we also witnessed a platform for dialogue that was established inside region for multilateral dialogue. So the Baghdad Conference for Cooperation and Partnership that was first held in Baghdad in August 2021 basically continued last year, and the second one took place in Amman, Jordan. The reasons for why it took place in Jordan, it's a bit complicated, but the main reason was because of the changes in government inside Iraq and the fact that the initiative needed to move forward in the sense of holding the second gathering, in essence, because of the fact that France and the EU were also involved in the preparation and organization of this initiative. So basically, for the first time, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, in addition to Egypt, Jordan, and Turkey, sat around the same table in August 2021. That was the first time Iran and Saudi were basically in the same room together after a few years. In the second gathering, Bahrain and Oman were also added. So basically, in the second one, we had all 6 GCC states, as well as Iran and Iraq, as well as the other broader Middle Eastern players. So basically, with this, how I'm seeing this is that a new platform for multilateral dialogue has been created, and specifically with in the second meeting that took place, regional economic integration also came to focus. So we have that angle to go with as well. But that's not to say that the hope, what I'm trying to say is very rosy in the sense that peace is possible, cooperation is possible. But as we heard from the previous presentation, the whole point of this is to pick up the phone rather than pick up the gun. So we're trying to see what is possible and what's not, and what are the bumps on the road. So for example, looking at economic integration, within the region, there are already a lot of issues, particularly inter-GCC competition. Even though the GCC Common Market Agreement was signed in 2008, and that led to having low trade barriers, but inter-GCC non-oil trade is tripling, and basically it's at an average of 10% of total trade on average for each of those countries. So why is this? The main reason is there's a lack of a regional infrastructure, and there's no consideration of a regionalized supply chain. And all of these countries are, particularly the 6 GCC countries, are focused on attaining their needs through international agreements from far away. There's also a general weak private sector in the entire region, not just the GCC, including Iran and Iraq, as well as other countries in the face of state-run corporations. Aside from these technical issues, there's the political aspects that are really a barrier for increased cooperation in the region, including global concerns over Iran's nuclear program. That entails sanctions on Iran and prohibition of certain types of trade and partnerships with Iran. There's also the ongoing protests in Iran, which at the same time as the fact that it's challenging the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic inside Iran, it will have long-term consequences in the entire region as well, depending on where it's going to lead. But the World Bank argues that all of these are issues that add up to high trading costs and have become non-tariff impediments to trade. But what we're trying to look is to find a regional economic integration framework that has multilateral partnerships and cooperation as its main goal. So basically, the whole point is to design multi-party projects. Obviously, within bilateral dialogues and within the bilateral relationships between countries, there are many projects that are being agreed on. There are MOUs being signed and whatnot, and most of them might not even succeed. But what the point here is to have more than two countries involved in these projects that we are basically trying to figure out with regard to this project, and they could include two or more regional players in addition to external players and powers. This could come in the form of basically all of this requires funds and money. So this could be done through the sovereign wealth funds of each of these states, the co-investment programs, economic zones, and so on. And this could also take place using regional banks and multinational institutions like the Islamic Development Bank or the various state-owned sovereign wealth funds, as well as Europeans like the European Investment Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. For example, a joint industrial partnership could take place, which looks at various sectors: petrochemicals, renewable energy, agriculture and food, pharmaceuticals and health, climate change, metals, minerals, and different downstream products. So I'm not going to get into this part of it for this presentation, but one of the angles that we're really focused on is the fact that external players and powers are needed in order to advance any of these initiatives, particularly because the know-how, the main requirement is know-how, and the region really lacks in that arena. But for example, when we look at the global scene, we see the US. So the US coming to the recent Iran-Saudi agreement that was signed in China, we could see that in comparison, the US has a one-sided approach towards the region. And that's because it has basically severed diplomatic ties with Iran since the 1980s. And basically, there's no role for the US to play in such as a mediator or as a facilitator of dialogue in the region that would be inclusive of Iran. That's why all of the regional initiatives that has been done by the US, that has been proposed by the US, is excluding Iran. And that's why it lacks that inclusivity, which is a requirement for regional dialogue and cooperation. The European Union has been adamantly working on increasing its footprint inside the region. It has basically proposed this new joint communication less than a year ago to the European Parliament on expanding relations with the Gulf region. Again, in that, there is a certain room for working with Iran, but because of the lack of any concrete progress on the nuclear deal and the negotiations that are continuing, that have been stalled now, there hasn't been an explicit mention of Iran. But at least there is a room for it because of the fact that the Europeans have diplomatic relations with both sides of the Gulf, and that allows them to move forward, particularly with regard to looking at the Baghdad Conference for Cooperation and Partnership. France, through President Macron, but also the EU through the EEAS, which is the European External Action Service, has been very involved in organizing that gathering and the subsequent agreements and initiatives that come through that. Russia has been engaged with all countries in the region as well, even though its relations are not to the level that would anytime even replace that of those countries with the US. It's noteworthy to see the reaction of the GCC states towards the war in Ukraine and how that factors into the broader power politics and the global power competition in the region. And China, we saw with the recent announcement of the agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, China has really increased its presence and role in the region. Technically, it has become the guarantor of this agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is a very important fact at the moment, because both countries have that level of respect towards China, which is lacking in comparison to when we look at their relationship with countries in the West, and particularly with the US and European countries. So that allows China to have even a bigger role in the region in the sense of guaranteeing the implementation of that agreement. So we would know more within the next 2 months if this agreement holds or not. But generally, I just want to say that external support could push the region towards realizing that vast economic potential that exists, and it's a requirement. I'll quickly just mention three of the basically the subsections of the project that we're looking at. So basically, energy, it has two parts: energy as in petrochemicals and oil and gas, and renewables. But for the energy, for the oil and gas part, it's important to focus on that because countries in the region still rely largely on oil and gas, and there's a long way to go for the green transition. But meanwhile, again, all of these projects that we're looking at have that multilateral angle. We really want to move past projects that have that just bilateral, looking at it bilaterally, because it wouldn't serve the purpose of this multilateral initiative that we're pushing for. So, for example, we have oil and gas in Iran and Iraq are untapped because of lack of technology, outdated technology and machinery, but also because of the fact that they have not had the required technology to I forgot the name to know the amount of resources that they have. So this disconnect basically provides various opportunities for regional and international cooperation. Investing in Iran and Iraq's petrochemical industry is one aspect, but there's also more to look at. There are more than 27 joint oil and gas fields that Iran shares with its neighbors, and there are dozens of more between GCC states themselves as well as with Iraq. So looking at how to basically define the boundaries using international law, but also scoping the contours of a framework for unitization in these joint fields is an important aspect to look at. But also LNG tolling and re-exporting. So for example, Iran and Iraq do not have the required technologies and facilities for liquefied natural gas. But Iran is the largest, has the largest gas reserves in the world. So it would be beneficial to come to terms to an agreement with Oman and Qatar, which have already been discussed in the past, with partnerships with external powers and players for the export of LNG, re-exportation or tolling of such, particularly now with this current energy crisis. But at the same time, we should look at the transition towards green and renewables. So reducing fossil fuel consumption requires increasing energy efficiency as well. So developing the designs for cross-border renewable projects that include Iran, Iraq, and the GCC states is crucial. So looking at solar power, waste recycling, carbon capture and storage, green energy and hydrogen are the key areas that are basically the hot topics now. But one angle to look at is basically looking at how we could establish such joint projects on bordering areas that could divide the outputs or in third countries by investments with external players. At the same time, a sustainable economic trade relationship entails a vigorous global market for imports of green energy and hydrogen or whatnot from the region as well. So building the necessary infrastructure for green energy, LNG, hydrogen, and recycled carbon is crucial, particularly inside Europe as well as elsewhere. This would lead to more cooperation also on nuclear. So nuclear, Iran and Saudi Arabia and the UAE are moving forward with their nuclear energy projects. And cooperation in this field is of utmost importance, for example, for international organizations like the IAEA, but also for European countries. For example, the Euratom Treaty and the mechanisms that have been created afterwards could be seen as rubrics for how cooperation could take place between these three countries on the nuclear front. And most importantly, and it's been a hot topic, it's electricity and connecting the power grids and how that could also take shape. For time, how much time do I have? 2 minutes. I will just quickly finish with the environment and we could move to questions if you have any. So shared environmental challenges are also costing the region a lot. So the UN estimates, for example, that the MENA region loses over 115 billion annually. That's approximately 13 billion or 2.5% in GDP for each country on average. So this allows for these countries to look at how to come up with initiatives and projects to look at water shortages, sandstorms, as well as the heat waves and pollution. So these are the key areas that are basically considered in this part of the project. Having COP28 taking place in the UAE later this year in November provides that platform for regional countries to come up with these regional solutions for these common shared issues. And most importantly, it's this idea for regional infrastructure for food security. So already the region has a vast infrastructure that's really connected. All of the countries are somehow connected to one another, and aspects for completing the remaining parts to connect, particularly with regards to road and rail, are being done. Basically, the GCC railway that has been in talks for more than 20 years, it's finally moving forward. The part of the train line between Iran and Iraq that had basically disconnected the two countries is finally moving forward in completing that part. And there are these international road transport intermodal operations that are taking place. For example, recently a shipment took place from UAE to Turkey that cut the time from 21 days to 7 days, which is quite an achievement. So the region has the required transportation links, but it's lacking cooperation on securing food and agriculture, particularly to deal with the food security issues that there is. Yesterday and today, with the trip by the Iranian security official to the UAE, one of the main talks was on how the UAE could guarantee its food supply and basically decrease its food security issues through Iran. This just shows the potential that exists, and a recent report that was published basically says that if regional integration with Iran were to take place, it will be possible to connect to existing transportation networks spanning South Asia and going all the way to Bangladesh. So there's a vast potential that exists in the region that we could look into. I'm not going to get into this because of time, but I'll be happy to respond to any questions you might have.
Thank you so much. We got 4 more minutes if some of you want to add something. On the web platform, we don't have questions or comments now. So yes, I don't know if someone in the bridge room wants to add something to this wonderful presentation.
Thank you to both presenters. I thought both presentations were extremely interesting. This goes to the first one and to Dr. Fry, I believe. I really appreciated all of the extensive research that you did, especially looking at economic interdependence, especially within the context of the European Union and other case studies. One thing that I couldn't help but think of was that this is all really impactful for within your own context. So like other European Union nations don't go to war with each other. But then taken applicably, what about international conflicts? I was wondering if you encountered any of that in your studies as well.
For that question. One of there's several different ways to go with that. I think in my fantasy life, and I hope it comes a reality life, I can imagine a global peace system where the institution of war has basically been eliminated and we've gone all the way global. So we might get there in different ways. We might get there through a series of regional peace systems, which then can build to the global, or we might jump to the global. I think some of the same principles could apply. Obviously, you get the challenge of scale. You get more actors, more players involved, and so forth. It becomes more challenging. But on the other hand, I think what we've isolated here is certain features that peace systems use to keep the peace and maintain the peace. And they're not necessarily so complicated. But to make them explicit and to hold that goal, and then to adhere to a new set of norms, and we could add laws. We didn't explicitly talk about legal structure. But another thought on this, going in a different direction, is what motivates countries or actors or in general to form a peace system. We're only able to allude to it in passing here on the importance scale, but not in all cases, but in many cases, it seems to be an external threat that helps different units come together and gets them going on the path of an internal peace system, right? Due to an external threat. Now, traditionally, that's been a military threat, but on today's planet, as we can all see, we're facing many, even interrelated global threats here, right? The loss of biodiversity, poisoning of our seas, losing the seas, we lose algae, we lose oxygen. Ozone is now being threatened once again by the brush fires, the wildfires that have become extreme, and on and on and on. Climate change, let's just say climate change and move on. You know what they are. So that could be a huge motivator to really wake up people on the planet that the external threat is now us ourselves. And we just have to give up this institution of dealing with our conflicts through force and threat of force, and survival of everybody, not just some of us, but everybody. It really requires the development of a global peace system. So it could come in different ways. I just hope we're clever enough as species to realize this in time. Thank you for that question. Do you want to add something, Moran? Let me just comment with that transition, though. I was so impressed with the vast number of details that you're outlining there across different sectors, from energy to green energy to food security and so forth. And I see the connection right there relating back to your question of great things can happen. One, I quoted Monet at one point there in terms of the baby steps, right? Just move forward. Well, it looks to me like there's a whole variety of different steps that are being taken and could be taken. But Monet also held strongly that you need to keep your eyes on the prize, so to speak, and have that goal. So if the goal is integration of Gulf and Middle Eastern resources and structure, that should be at every opportunity made explicit. This is what we're doing, and this is why we're doing it. But thoughts?
Thank you.
That there is no hierarchy, which is very important. There is also no possessions, but you did not mention one third thing, which is justice. Is there justice within that? How can we ever get to a Middle East peace if there is no justice, if there is this huge imbalance of power between Israel and the Palestinians? And how can we achieve peace when there is so much greed that is driving all these wars?
Yes. Thank you for that question as well. I absolutely agree with you. There needs to be justice. And I would add part of justice is equality. There needs to be equality. So we saw that. And when you say the tribes, just to clarify, the anthropologists and me were talking about those nomadic forager type of social organization, which is longstanding. And basically, they have a good sense of justice in those situations. There's a lot of mediation goes on to try to help people work things out. I mentioned a few of them, discussions that occur late at night over the fire. When someone does something wrong, sometimes they're physically punished, or at least people give them the word, so to speak, that this is not the correct way to do this. So I certainly, the evidence supports, if you look anthropologically, ethnographically, that the violence does occur, but it's not by any means the primary way that nomadic foragers deal with conflicts. Just simply voting with their feet is very often the primary way, and then forget about it and go on with life. But they have a variety of mechanisms for doing this. And if you think about justice, which is your question, they're arriving at justice through these mechanisms each and every day, really. Now, someone feels wrong, and then what is the makeup? What is the solution here? And at one level, it's just, okay, I'll just walk along and forget about it. That's not so satisfying as justice, but it avoids violence. And at a more deeper level, let's talk this out and figure out who's right and who's wrong, and which of you are right and wrong in which ways. And this is the just thing. And we want everybody to be in the relationship positively. So let's work this out. So it's based on justice. And even the idea of the negative reciprocity, or someone is killed by somebody else, that sometimes is viewed as the resolution. For instance, if a fellow has seduced another man's wife, and I say that in a very sexist way that it's often written, it's often the woman just willingly and eagerly going off with another guy. But if that results in a homicide, people may just say, well, he really shouldn't have done that, so he got what he deserved. And that could be looked at as a just resolution. But the other way, perhaps more typical way it's looked at is, well, a life for a life, and then it's done, we're even. So that is very much a balance. It doesn't occur in all those cultures, but it occurs in many of them, as I alluded to. Middle East is a big jump to this, but I think the parallel for me, again, stepping back as the anthropologist who's read so much cross-culturally, is people everywhere have conflict resolution mechanisms. And I would argue people everywhere want that sense of justice whenever it can be achieved. And there's so many different ways to get there that they don't always have to be war and violence. There can be courts and arbitrations and walking away and on and on and on. So I glean from the anthropological literature, from the foragers and beyond, that there's absolutely no reason not to create systems at different levels of society. And that's what the peace systems examples show. Some of them are tribes, some of them are bands, some of them are kingdoms, some of them are nations, some of them are regional systems, if you see what I'm on. So they're across social organizations. That gives me some assessment that it's possible to do this. Did I catch most of the question?
Thank you so much, Douglas. Thank you for all our participants. Thank you so much, Mekran. I'm afraid we just run out of time. We are 5 minutes late, but it was a really great session, this peaceful building and sustainability in the Middle East. And we invite you to follow up with the rest of the Middle East Dialogue 2023. In 5 minutes, we will begin the keynote towards the Israeli-Palestinian settlement. So please feel free to join us in the meeting room or here virtually in the WABA app. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Have a wonderful day.